what was it later. You were
I
gone.
was,
You were
I
kind
was
of
just
going
glad
like
to see you
this.
in the country.
Well, we are now connected to YouTube. So, Mary, you may begin anytime you'd like.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Mary Jones. I serve as chair of the Marriage and Family Therapy Advisory Committee of the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Today's Friday, December 12th, 2025. I ask the members of the advisory committee to respond to roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that's being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic medium. Jim Kilmartin,
Present.
Nicole Eitzen,
Here.
Chris Haben,
Here.
Betsy Henderson,
Here.
Stacy Hodges,
Present.
Renisha Hunter,
Present.
and Diane Siebel.
I don't see Diane on the.
Okay, and Heidi Belloff.
Present.
Okay, and I note the following staff members are also present. David Fye.
Here.
And is Leslie on?
She is.
Okay.
I'm here.
Hi.
Thanks.
Next, David will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
Thank you, Mary. This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about any concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require individuals, the advisory committee, to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the Executive Director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. No time has been reserved for public comment, as no individuals requested time for public comment. Because we are conducting this meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to the meeting is being conducted by medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call or by viewing the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is being held remotely, the requirements of KOMA are not suspended. Therefore, we will be conducting this meeting pursuant to the KOMA. On October 20th, 2025, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of such meetings. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other meeting material have been posted on the board's website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda specifically by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and YouTube channel and allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if we have any technical issues during the meeting, you may call the board office at 785-296-3240 or send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. The recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. The conference call line is active. I checked it before we got started. There's no one currently on the line, but if I hear someone beep over and state their name, I will let you know.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, everyone, the next item of business will be our agenda approval. Everyone should have received the agenda with their meeting materials today. Were there any changes or additions to the agenda? If not, I'll take a motion to approve.
I move.
I second.
Thank you. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Thank you. The next item of business is the minutes from the October 10th meeting, which was also in your packet this morning. Any comments, suggestions, changes? If not, I'll take a motion to approve.
I motion to approve.
Thanks, Nicole. Is there a second?
I second.
Thank you. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed, same sign. Okay, thanks. Dave, I'll hand it to you for your director's report.
All right, thank you, Mary. Each meeting I do tend to provide updates on 3 different items: operations, legislative items, and then board meeting updates to make sure that you all are informed of recent items from the recent board meetings. So we'll start with operations. First, Just wanted to make sure that you all received an email from me concerning the annual training for board members and advisory committee members. In the past, we have done the annual training a few different ways. Once upon a time, it was done by legal counsel for the board. I took over that assignment when I became executive director to do the training myself for all of you. And in the past, we've done that training at each one of the advisory committees. But since that is a lengthy training, we have tried to become a little bit more efficient with that. So this year, we're doing that training as an on-demand training. So it's being recorded. It's about 54 minutes. So go ahead and complete that training. If possible, try to complete that before the end of December. And when you complete it, just by viewing the training, go ahead and send me an email back, and I can cross you off the list to verify that you've done the annual training. And if you have any questions, please feel free to follow up with me. One of the only drawbacks of doing it on demand is there's not the opportunity for live questions during the training or afterwards. But please feel free to remember that you can always use me as a resource if you do have questions after viewing that material. A second update on operations. This is a reminder for all of you or people that you are connected to continue to encourage people to activate their free CE broker accounts if they would like to do so. Just as a reminder, for the past year, we've had all 7 professions live under the CE broker system as an optional resource for all licensees at no cost to give them a platform where they can upload documentation of the completion of their continuing education hours, so that if they are selected for audit when they renew their license, instead of sending information back the traditional method, if they're using CE Broker as a resource, we can go into the portal, verify the hours, verify they're in the right categories, and then complete the audit more quickly. And so it's not a requirement for all licensees when we reach that agreement. We wanted to make sure that everyone had the ability to opt into it versus making a requirement. But we do see a benefit, and we have heard positive feedback from individuals. So we would encourage you to go ahead and use CE Broker as a resource. And if you do hear of any issues people are having, please let us know. We are meeting with the CE Broker staff now that it's all fully up and operational about every 6 months, just to check in, to get some feedback as far as what the uptake has been, what is working, if there's any issues we can resolve. So happy to be good partners with CE Broker, and overall it's been a positive thing for the board this year. In terms of another operations update, we are still planning to launch our Jurisprudence Live initiative. That is the optional webinars that we are going to be offering for each of the professions as essentially a substitute for a requirement of passing a jurisprudence examination. Some other states have a requirement of a separate test to become licensed or at renewal or different things like that. The board explored some options for that, but we wanted to offer it in a different way and incentivize it rather than make it a requirement. So we are still planning to launch those optional Jurisprudence Live webinars. We will have more information on that soon. We've been testing available technology, and I think we're close to launching it. Hopefully later this month, we'll be able to provide some information on dates when we will have those opportunities. And then we plan to do those quarterly going forward. One of the big items that we've been working on behind the scenes here is a new background check for licensure. And this would be something the board has recently agreed to implement, in part because of the requirements of a lot of the multi-state compacts that Kansas has passed. Kansas has now passed 3 multi-state compacts for the professions regulated by the BSRB, which includes the psychology profession under SIPAC, that compact, the professional counseling compact, and also most recently the social work compact. And so one of those compacts is fully operational and live. One is just getting live in a couple of states and trying to have more states go live. And the social work compact is probably about 9 months away. But one of the requirements for individuals to practice under each of those compacts is a background check as a condition of licensure. So what the board has recently agreed to is that for new applicants as of a certain date, there will be a background check requirement. We're working with KBI to make sure that process will run smoothly, that our staff are properly trained in how to access the system and how to handle that sensitive information. And then also there will be a mechanism for individuals who are currently licensed to be able to opt in if they would like to do a background check so that they could potentially become eligible for a compact if one exists for their profession. Some of the professions basically have a background check requirement, but a lot of the states don't have background checks for licensure. So making these two systems mesh has been a little bit difficult for a lot of states. And so we have a statute in place which provides the board the authority to make it a requirement, but we're trying to make that opt-in mechanism so that individuals who are currently licensed can do that, but we're not requiring everybody else who's currently licensed to go through that process if they already are licensed to begin with. So it will be a new requirement for new applicants. There will be an optional opt-in mechanism for existing applicants, and we don't have a specific date of that yet. We're still trying to get the system built for us to be able to note when someone has had a background check and if there were any issues. We're also getting that language approved through the regulatory process. And so there's a few different steps, but we are moving forward on that. So that is something you'll probably be seeing news about in the near future. And then as another operations update, we are wrapping up our review and completion of the surveys that we had done earlier this year. We surveyed all 7 professions, I think, for the first time in BSRB history. Currently, we have about 16,000 or more licensees, and so it was a lot of individuals who responded to the surveys, but we got so much good information. We have had draft reports on our website since those were available earlier this year. We are now in the process of converting all the draft reports to final reports. Our goal is to have those all converted by the end of December. We also will have a comparison report that has some of the similar questions between professions, and our goal is to have a draft of the comparison report available before the end of this month. So hopefully that will be available for the board to review at the January board meeting, and then hopefully not too late after that, we'll have that comparison report converted from a draft report to a final report. So we're wrapping up this process. It's been a big undertaking this year. My staff have done some great work helping analyze a lot of information, summarize that information. So we're wrapping up that last piece too. Moving to some legislative items. One of the items I want to make you all aware of concerning the BSRB's budget, all state agencies are required to submit a budget. And the statutory deadline is October 1st. It's requested they be submitted by September 15th. So we submitted our budget with revised expenditure estimates for the current year, which is fiscal year 26, and also the budget year, which is fiscal year 27. Last year, the legislature was in fiscal year 25, and they approved a budget for fiscal year 26 and 27. So this year we submitted adjustments. And essentially what we submitted was the same amounts that were approved by last year's legislature with one technical correction. The legislature implemented a pay increase for state employees beginning in fiscal year 26, but with a weird quirk of the budgetary system, the money was only added for fiscal year 26 and it was not added for fiscal year 27. So just to maintain that amount between the 2 years, it's not a new increase, but just to make sure it wasn't treated like a one-year bonus, the legislature will have agencies essentially ask for authority to match the amount that was added for 26 or was authorized to be spent. So as a fee-funded agency, we don't receive any money from the state general fund, but we do request an expenditure limitation every year. So that's the only difference in what we were approved for compared to the new budget revised estimate. In terms of the budget process, if that is something that you track, the legislature did start something new last year. Traditionally, the way that the budget process has worked is agencies submit a budget request or a revised estimate in the fall. The Division of Budget under the governor's office reviews that information. When the legislative session starts in January, the governor comes out with a governor's budget report or recommendation, which includes expenditures for all agencies. And then the legislature has historically used that as their starting point for the session. And then they make either adjustments to add funding or remove funding from that governor's recommendation. Last year, the legislature started a new process in which they actually began to review some agency budget submissions, but with interim committees in the fall. And the legislature had their own budget bill that they proposed and then worked from that as the starting point. And so by law, the governor does need to submit a budget, but the legislature is not required necessarily to follow the governor's recommendation. And so the legislature began a new tradition last year, and they appear to be doing the same thing this year. They've had some interim budget committees that have met, reviewed certain agency budgets, and I think those have mostly wrapped up for the year. But I do think that they will be starting very quickly when the session starts. So we'll just be watching that. That should start in January of 2025. I mentioned that I would provide some updates on items from most recent board meetings. The board is continuing to work through the recommended changes to the unprofessional conduct regulations. You all had submitted some requested updates for the unprofessional conduct regulation. Also, other professions did the same thing. We took all of those recommended changes with also the current language of the regulations for unprofessional conduct, and our staff members worked to line up each item side by side, as long as there were comparable items between professions. So there is a giant grid of unprofessional conduct items, and the board is spending time at each board meeting going item by item to determine if the language can be standardized, if there's items that are missing for one profession, should they be added? Are there reasons why there should be some items for only certain professions and not for others? So I anticipate, based on how that process is going, that will probably continue for another 2 board meetings, and then we will probably reach the end of that project. And then the board will be able to vote on the recommended changes. And then once that happens, we'll be submitting the language for review from the Department of Administration, the Attorney General's office, and ultimately, when that language is approved, we'll be able to put that out for public comment. So we will keep you informed of the steps in the process, but if you are following the board meetings, there will likely be at least 2 more board meetings where those items are reviewed and considered. And then also for the board's investigative process, the board has had a group of a subset of board members called the Complaint Review Committee that review complaints against practitioners and the write-ups by the investigators for the BSRB. The board recently determined to expand the number of board members serving on that complaint review committee from 5 members to 6 members. And so the newest member on the complaint review committee is board chair David Anderson, who is a master's level psychologist. So now there will be 6 members of the CRC moving forward, and really appreciate all the board members for their work. It's a very important committee and it does take a lot of time, but appreciate all the board members for their service on that. Now, if you don't mind indulging me just for a couple minutes, I started as executive director for the BSRB about 5 years ago. I came on board in November of 2020. And so I thought it would be kind of fun as we reach the end of the year and also the end of 5 years as executive director, just to reflect back on some of the big changes for the BSRB just in my time here. 5 years, it seems like a short period of time. And I know we're scratching the surface on some initiatives, but I feel like as a board and with the assistance of the advisory committee and the staff here at the office, we've made a lot of really positive changes. So I just wanted to highlight some of those changes that have occurred over the last 5 years and also highlight a couple of the items that we're still actively working towards. First, back in 2020, right before I started, the board made a major change in shifting to a new licensing system. The board previously had used an access database for a lot of the licensing purposes and transitioned to a licensed database called My Licensed Office, IMLO. That really expanded what the board was able to do and made the information secure in different ways. And that has been helpful for us, but it does have some limitations. And so when the board was able to consider alternative options in recent years, the state passed a bill to expand and allow agencies to opt into the state's enterprise licensing system with a company called Acela. And so that is the new process. We're about a year into a 2-year process of moving the state's licensing system from IMLO to Acela. They've done a lot of the work identifying our existing processes, our existing forms. We're in that process to move to the new licensing system, which should give us even more functionality. So moving to IMLO was a big step, and moving to Acela will be another big step, which will allow us to have more integrated processes, people applying for licensure online, and a lot of other things. So more information there to come, but that has been a big change behind the scenes as the licensing system changes. We were also able to create a payment portal on the website over the last 5 years with the assistance of the Information Network of Kansas. We moved staff members away from traditional desktop computers to laptop computers. You may recall that the traditional model was all staff in the office all the time. When the pandemic happened, staff members had to work from home because of safety reasons and other reasons, and it really moved the agency forward. We developed a remote policy modeled after what the Department of Administration required, but we also shifted to better technology to allow staff members to work more productively at home, to allow it to be more of an at-home office. And so that was a big help to staff members. We also did a big upgrade to the agency's website, moving it from the previous Sitefinity platform to Granicus. That allowed us to have more accessibility for individuals accessing the website with a mobile device, and also it streamlined our processes. So if individuals came to the website looking for one thing in particular, we were able to do that. But that was a big change behind the scenes. There were a lot of meetings that went into that design change, and so moving to a new website was a big change. We also are in the process, and news will be coming out here shortly, of preparing to be part of the state's unified license verification portal. So that is something that also was in that bill that I mentioned, the state's Acela platform for the state licensing boards that wanted to move to that new platform. Part of that was also to create a website where you could type in someone's name in the state of Kansas, and it would tell you if they were licensed by any of the state licensing boards. And so, of course, we will still have our verification portal on our website, but this will be a different website that you can type someone's name in. So we've been working on this. We've been testing it out. I think we're pretty close to it going live, but I think you'll have more information on that shortly after the start of the year. We reviewed and updated our document retention schedules here in the office. Previously, we were required to keep all documents here until someone's license expired, and then for 5 years, and then for 5 years after that. So we had until expiration and then about 10 years. And so we had a lot of paper records here in the office. And so we were able to make some changes and actually move about 40 tall file cabinets of paper documents to the Historical Society for archiving. And by doing that, we were able to actually free up space to allow us to expand our staff and give them permanent places to be working. We also encountered the issue I mentioned as far as staffing. Over the years, the BSRB has licensed more and more people. We've expanded from overseeing about 12,000 people to over 16,000 currently, but during a lot of that time, the staff at the BSRB had not changed. And so there was more work on staff members' plates, and it was difficult to process things quickly and different things like that. So now we have better technology for that, and we also have some additional staff members. We started with 9 staff members, and now we are at 12, which has allowed us to have a point person in terms of renewals and a point person in charge of reciprocity applicants from other states, and individuals who are helping in other different areas, but that can specialize a little bit with that. So I think that has been really positive, and now we have good space for those employees because of the retention schedule changes. We launched the CE broker agreement to provide that service to all licensees to make our auditing system a little bit smoother. We also have increased attendance, representation, and leadership in national associations. And that's something I'm really proud of. You know, when I started, we are members of different national associations, and we are asked to attend those meetings and represent the state and make sure that our voice is being heard. And as a composite board, it's really important that we're there because we have a unique perspective. We have 7 professions, and we want to make sure that our tiered licensure and other things that are relevant in Kansas are reflected by the national associations, especially when they come to things like drafting multi-state compacts and other things like that. And so since I've been here, there has been an increase in our attendance at those meetings, but there's also been an increase of board members attending those meetings and representing the state, and board members willing to serve in committees and in leadership positions. I think we have mentioned at the last meeting that Mary Jones is the president-elect for the American Marriage and Family Therapy Regulatory Board Association. And so we're really excited about Mary stepping into that role, but also the other board members that have been commissioners for some of the compacts or served on different committees. And so I'm really happy to see them out there. And we've even taken a step forward this year of doing joint presentations where as staff for the agency and also for board members, we're presenting information. We're trying to become leaders in these different areas. And so people are asking questions about what Kansas is doing and trying to follow our model. And that's been really exciting to see. So as we, initially we're trying to learn from everybody. Now we're trying to share the resources we have, and it's been really exciting to see that. In terms of other updates, we cleaned up our advisory committee policy. When I first started, we had advisory committees that were serving, and members were serving 2-year terms, but a lot of those terms were sort of blended together. And we went through the process of cleaning up that process and made sure that when the 2 years was up, individuals would be asked, do you want to seek reappointment? And then those were provided to the chair of the board to make those determinations. But we also made sure that we were holding to the maximum length of time. And so that has allowed us to have new voices be part of the advisory committee process. And it's been really beneficial, I think, to see so many people serve on these advisory committees. I think this is one of the biggest strengths of the BSRB, is that we have not just the 12 board members and the BSRB staff, but we have roughly 60 volunteers that serve on the advisory committees that dedicate their time to being able to discuss important issues and give recommendations back to the board. So that's not what all states have. And I think it's great that we're so connected to licensees and we can hear from so many different perspectives. So really appreciate all of your work on the advisory committee and really happy to have a system that supports the professions and hears from so many different voices. And then one of the other big things that we've done in the last 5 years was the survey. We've done a couple of surveys for the social work profession over the years, but to my knowledge, we've never done a survey of all of our professions. And it was a massive undertaking. It was challenging at times to have so much information and how do we sift this and summarize it in a productive way, but it's a good problem to have. I think our licensees were very generous with their time and the feedback they provided to us, and I think it will help drive the work of the board and the advisory committees in years to come. In terms of some of the licensing changes, there were the significant change to reciprocity laws. The state of Kansas passed a bill back in 2021 that wasn't called universal licensure, but has been referred to it over the years. And it basically changed the amount of time someone would need to wait if they were licensed in another jurisdiction and they were coming to Kansas to practice as well. It was primarily focused on military members and military spouses when it was introduced, but initially the final version transitioned to apply to also individuals who reside in Kansas and individuals that intend to reside in Kansas. And so the board had an existing reciprocity statute. That statute initially required 5 years of practice and then had been shortened to 48 months of the last 54 months in terms of individuals qualifying for licensure by reciprocity. But with that universal licensure law passing and reducing the length of time down to 12 months, there were two different standards. And so to assist with workforce issues and also to make things more compatible between the two different timeframes, the board was able to get statutory changes to decrease the length of time for reciprocity licensure down to 12 months to match that universal licensure standard. And I think that decrease has allowed us to license more people. It's allowed us to license more people more quickly. And it's really been a positive change in terms of workforce and allowing people to come to Kansas more quickly. We've also been able to keep people licensed in different ways than we had previously. We had heard from some people who said, I had a big situation come up this year involving my health or someone's close to me that I'm taking care of. I wasn't able to finish my CE hours. I would like to stay licensed, but I don't want to lie on my renewal and claim that I completed hours that I didn't. Is there some way that you can, extend my license or something else? And we really didn't have authority to do that. And so what we were able to get put into law, the board supported the ability for individuals to request 3 months of additional time solely to complete CE hours. And they had to demonstrate an extenuating circumstance, which was an extreme condition outside of their control that really necessitated them not being able to complete their hours. And then if they were approved for that and provided a plan, they would get 3 months of additional time, not as an extension of their license. They would still need to renew their license, but they would be able to have 3 months to complete those CE hours. And it allowed us to keep those people licensed. And I think it's been really helpful. The individuals who have submitted items requesting this, we've walked them through that process. And I think this has been a really positive way to also address workforce by keeping people licensed who are on the fence and considering leaving. This is a way for us to keep people in the workforce if they want to stay employed. We've also been able to help people come back to the profession if they stepped away for a long-term reason. Let's say that someone wanted to start a family or do something else, and they allowed their license to expire several years in the past. The requirements to become licensed again require that someone essentially complete all of the CE hours from a past time period. And so for some individuals, they said, I would like to renew my license, but it's going to take me some time to do that. Is there something that can be done? And so listening to those voices, we designed a 6-month temporary reinstatement license. This is designed for people who've been out of the profession for at least a year, but who haven't completed those CE hours, but would like to be able to work 6 months while completing the hours. So this temporary license allowed them to work for a limited amount of time to earn some money to pay for some of those CEs. And once they finished the CEs, they were able to fully reinstate their license. Also, for individuals who've been out of the profession for at least a year, the cost to reinstate the license was cut in half. It previously said that their cost would be the cost of a renewal of a license plus a reinstatement fee, but as a motivating factor to bring people back to the profession, for those that have been out for at least a year, the cost was cut in half. In terms of the temporary licenses, you may recall several years back, the range of time for the temporary licenses was not consistent, and the cost of temporary licenses was also not consistent between the professions. We were able to sync that up and make those all 24 months and then also all $50. So those temporary licenses are very affordable. It also allows people the opportunity to practice while they're taking the licensing examination, and that's been a really positive change we were able to get put in law as well. We were able to sync up the professions in terms of the number of hours for clinical licensure to decrease that down from 4,000 hours to 3,000 hours, and the supervision required from 150 hours down to 100 hours. We were able to create a student temporary addiction counselor license as a way to help get people into the addiction counseling profession and be able to work under a situation in which they were employed at a facility and under supervision. They have to have an agreement with their school and the employer and have at least 60 hours in an addiction related field, and essentially be taking classes towards completion of their degree so they can become an addiction counselor. But that's been a nice student level license that we've been able to use, been very popular, and it's been able to get people into that profession a little early. We've also been able to work with other states to find solutions to some of our items. As we attended national association meetings, we learned about something they had in Minnesota, which was a temporary student candidacy license for individuals in the social work profession who had attended programs that were in candidacy for accreditation but not accredited yet. And there was an issue in terms of those online programs meeting the standards of traditional licensure. And so we were able to get that put into law as a way for individuals that graduate from the programs before accreditation to be able to take the licensing examination and then also work under a temporary license. And then once accreditation happens, they can get the permanent license that way. We also were able to do a lot of updates to our regulations. I'm not going to go through all of those, but one of the notable ones, there was previously a definition of in residence as an alternative requirement for licensure. Either you attended an accredited school or you needed to get half of your classwork in residence, which was defined as being physically present at the school. Well, for online only schools, there was no feasible way for them to meet that language. And also for some schools that have hybrid programs, there was a desire to expand this to allow individuals to meet the qualification remotely. And so we expanded that definition of in residence to have face-to-face requirements by screen as long as there was synchronous video conferencing. And so that has also allowed us to have more individual applicants meet the standards for licensure by expanding that definition. And then in terms of outreach, Leslie Allen and I, the assistant director, we talk to many different groups. We do presentations for lots of different schools talking about how to apply for licensure, making sure that students are aware of their professional responsibilities they'll be under as licensees, talking about the unprofessional conduct regulations. We've had presentations to employers. We've had presentations to large groups of educators. We've done lunch and learn presentations to different associations. We've presented information at conferences. We're really trying to be proactive and getting information out there. There's a ton of information on the website, and I'm really proud of that we've been able to accomplish. So just as a final thought, as a reflection of 5 years, I do want to thank the board for entrusting me in this position. I feel a tremendous responsibility, but also a tremendous honor. This is a unique position, and I feel like we have an opportunity to do a lot of good here. So I really want to thank the board for that. I've really been lucky. I've had a lot of great board members, and I really appreciate that they have been so proactive and willing to try a lot of different things, and also inspire me to, push me to do different things so that we can get a lot of things accomplished. And the staff here has been amazing. over the 5 years that I've been here. I'm knocking on wood because I know this doesn't happen very often, but we've only had one staff member who has left over 5 years, and we've been able to expand the staff by 3. So I know that's unusual. People are going to retire, things are going to happen, but it's been a great thing for me to have such a consistent group of great staff. They've been doing a lot of good work. And then last, I just want to thank all of you as advisory committee members. I really do appreciate all the work that you do. A lot of the good items the board considers are initiated through the advisory committees or built in these advisory committees. And so I want you to know that we really do appreciate all the time you spend in these meetings, all of your feedback, all of your questions. And so thank you for all the work that you do, and look forward to working with you more in the next year to come. So with that, I will wrap up my presentation, my report, and see if there's any questions over any of the items that I talked about.
Yeah, any questions from anyone?
I just want to say that's a lot that's happened in a short amount of time. Like, as you were sharing, I was like, wow. I mean, I knew about many of the things, but maybe not all of them because they're more behind the scenes. But that's, yeah, impressive. So thanks for sharing all that.
Well, thank
Yeah,
you.
I think, yeah, I was going to just add in that too. I think, it is the important work of the advisory committees that get to the board and David's leadership and bringing things back to the board for us to consider. But, it's really an accomplishment of so many. But David, you've done such a fantastic job pushing forward things that we need to consider. So it's pretty incredible.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
You've also grown this awesome beard.
That's right. Not
Well,
the least of which is the beard. That's right. Well, very good. Thank you all so much. And certainly echo David's comments about the advisory committee work. It may seem like we're not getting a lot of traction, but in the time that I've been involved with this advisory committee, it's just been a tremendous lift of everything that we reviewed and recommended. So thank you so much for your time that you dedicate to this. I would like to move the agenda now to continued review and discussion of draft survey of licenses. Looks like we had some places that we were going to continue to talk about and have discussion. Additional ways the BSRB could protect and serve consumers. So David, I'll hand it back to you, but it looks like we're kicking off in page 23 there.
Yes, and I apologize to the members of the committee getting the material to you so late, but I know we've had several meetings to review this survey report and wanted to focus on a couple questions. So I'll just kind of walk through the last 2 questions on the survey and talk a little bit about some of the items that stood out to me. But I'd love to hear your reflections and what stood out to you, if things surprised you. So starting on page 23, we're going to be looking at question 17 for both the LMFTs and also the LCMFTs. And that question said, based on your experience as a licensee in Kansas, do you have any recommendations on additional ways the BSRB could protect and serve consumers of services offered by BSRB licensees? And this question was basically phrased with some intention to remind people that as a licensing agency, we are directed by the legislature to be a public protection agency and protect and serve consumers of services. And so we asked all the licensees, are there additional ways that we could make improvements in that process? Are there things that you would recommend? And so for the LMFTs, 49 LMFTs responded to the survey, and there's a summary of information on page 23. The full responses from the LMFTs can be found in Appendix 15 on page 62. 27 of the 49 indicated having no recommendations to provide. So I don't want to just skip over that quickly. That is, roughly a little more than half of the individuals. We allowed them the opportunity to provide feedback on anything, and they said, no, we don't have any additional comments or recommendations for you. So I think that is notable. For the individuals that did express some recommendations, some of the items that were included were prioritizing more communication between the BSRB and licensees, considering reciprocity privileges with other states or a multi-state compact, offering more online options and services, or developing ethical guidelines for the use of AI. And then for the LCMFT responses, 161 LCMFTs answered the question. The full responses can be found on page 64 in Appendix 16. 86 of the 161, so just over half, indicated having no recommendations to provide. So I found that also to be notable. For the individuals who did provide comments or recommendations, some of the items that were frequently noted were establishing recommendations and best practices for the use of artificial intelligence, fight for improved insurance reimbursements, allow anonymous complaints, particularly when a licensee is reporting another licensee, speed up the investigative process, give more severe consequences for disciplinary matters, educate the public about the marriage and family therapy profession, prioritize getting more providers into rural and frontier areas, consider requiring peer consultation hours and suicide prevention and continuing education with each renewal, add in statute or regulation language concerning professional conduct in the community, support expanding the ability to virtually see clients across state lines, and create a method for regular communication and updates from BSRB to licensees. And some respondents focused more on group and private practices, expressing that both require more regulated oversight. Additionally, it was requested the BSRB advocate against harmful legislation. This being said, opposing statements were made as well, reporting the BSRB should remove themselves from politics altogether. So, as you might imagine, when you pull a large group of people, you're going to have differing opinions, and intelligent minds can disagree for sure. But we wanted to highlight some of the items that we saw with some regularity. Just as my personal comments and looking through the responses, I also would echo what some of the summary information here talks about. There does appear to be a desire for more communication from the BSRB, and that is something that we are actively working on. We are working on launching a newsletter for the professions and providing more frequent updates as far as that goes. We're also looking potentially at some other options for communication, but there also, it appeared to be maybe communication could be helpful in terms of a couple different issues that I'm not sure people are aware of. And one of those is our limitations in terms of allowing individuals to practice in other states. I think some of the phrasing and some of the responses seem to indicate that we could allow people to practice in other states, but we were just not allowing them to. And unfortunately, it's a little more complicated than that because every state has, legal authority to say who can practice and who can't within those states. And so while we have some control here in the state of Kansas, every state has their own ability to set those parameters. So some of that is outside of definitely what we can control. But there's also maybe a need for more communication in terms of the role that the BSRB plays in general. As a state agency, we are created to protect members of the public, and we're not necessarily, we're not an advocacy group. For some different associations, there's a national association, and for some professions, there's state level associations that advocate for the profession. And that's one of the distinctions we draw in some of the presentations that Leslie and I give when we talk about helping people understand the BSRB. We say, it's a regulatory board. We're created by the legislature, primarily for public protection, whereas a state level or national association is created by members of that association. They primarily wish to promote the profession or enhance the profession, and sometimes the goals will overlap, but there are some differences there. And I think, I think there was previously a state level association for marriage and family therapy that was active, and I understand, that group maybe is not as active as they used to be, or maybe does not exist. But I think that maybe some of the individuals who completed the survey thought perhaps that we filled that void a little bit, that perhaps we should be advocating for the marriage and family therapy profession. And while we're not opposed to that, we want all the professions to be, healthy. It's a little outside of our lane. So some of those things really stood out to me. We want to be good partners, but we also want people to understand sort of our role and our limitations as well. So I'll turn it over to you. I'm very curious to hear kind of what your thoughts were as you reviewed those responses, either in the summary information or in the open field answers. Was there anything that stood out to you, anything that you expected to see that you didn't, or vice versa? So what are your thoughts or comments about this survey question in particular.
I think something that stuck out to me was some of the stuff about like the investigative process and consequences, and I don't know if this will potentially be a part of the communication or the newsletter. Um, Something that I've learned is sometimes people just don't understand processes, and so maybe they're making assumptions about what an investigation is or what, like, when a consequence should be given out and when it's not. And I know that it's really hard to get granular because it's just hard to do that. But I wonder if just eventually, just like more understanding about what those investigative processes look like might help people understand why it does take longer. And yeah, the consequence side of things. Again, I know that that's pretty, that might be kind of tough to educate on, but I think sometimes if people just have more of an understanding about some of those things, that can help with some of that feedback. But that was, yeah, interesting to see on there.
Well, I agree, Nicole.
And,
Probably my own, I'm sorry, Radisha. Do you want to go ahead?
yes, I'm just kind of curious, is there some sort of grid process when there are consequences that are implemented for a licensee? Like how are decisions made and what is the scale to decide the disciplinary action for such behavior or, what does that look like?
Yeah, good question. There's not a grid. Most states don't have a grid. The types of penalties are listed in statute. There is a statute that says, if there's a violation of the statutes or unprofessional conduct or different things, the board's authority is they're able to suspend a license, revoke a license, issue an administrative fine of a certain amount. Condition a license. And when you condition a license that has a range of different things, you could have someone undergo things like supervision. You could require someone to take some additional continuing education hours in a certain area. You could even require something like therapy or counseling or alternative things. If you could have someone undergo a fitness for duty evaluation type thing. And so there's a range of different possibilities there. There's not a grid, and I've seen some states, there's very few that have them. I think one of the complicating factors to a grid is that sometimes it is very clearly one issue that is the issue, but other times there are several issues that all come into play, where there might be, in one situation there might be just someone didn't complete their continuing education hours when they renewed their license, and that's the issue, or they missed their deadline and they continued to practice, and then they had to do a self-report because they continued to practice for a few weeks after their expiration. In those cases, it's a very clear cut. In other situations, you might have a situation to where you have a dual relationship with the client, or there might be a confidentiality issue, and then there's a question of, is this person practicing below the standards of what a reasonable licensee would be expected to do. Or sometimes someone might have done something inappropriate, but also maybe were terminated for employment and didn't report that termination to the board to give us the opportunity to look at. And perhaps maybe we started to investigate and they didn't respond back. So there's also an issue with them not providing timely information or cooperating during the investigation. So when you have a number of those different factors, there's a question of, if you had a grid, would you just take all of those things and put them all together? So what happens with our situation is we do have an investigative policy. It's on the board's website under resources. It's about 9 pages long, and it talks about who serves on that member of the committee that reviews those complaints. It talks about the investigators for the board and the role that they play in terms of, if we receive a complaint, that they would request additional information from the licensee and then collect all that information. And then once it's ready to be reviewed, assuming we have jurisdiction, there's the subset of the board that reviews those complaints called the Complaint Review Committee. And it talks even about the composition of who serves on the Complaint Review Committee. There's always going to be a psychologist, there's always going to be a social worker, there's always going to be a public member. And now there's additional professions or additional public members that can serve, but they're all board members and they meet with legal counsel. So the process that we go through is defined. But I think for individuals that are going through that process, it's a very stressful time, understandably so on both sides. I think there can be some confusion. I think sometimes when people submit something to the board, we try to clarify that we don't take the role of criminal authority. We have limited authority in this area. We have administrative authority, so we don't take the role of criminal authority or law enforcement, and we don't have the manpower or the financial resources that a body like that would have to do investigations. We also have individuals that may file a complaint and may be a little confused with the process and feel like it's more of a civil process. If you sue someone, you basically are saying, I have been harmed and I want to get something back from that person, whether it's damages or something like that. And so in a civil case, you might be pursuing a resolution. With this situation, you're really filing a complaint with the board, and then the board is reviewing it. And if there is jurisdiction and it is something that would fall under the statutes and regulations, we're really acting on behalf of the state with that licensee concerning their professional responsibility. So while the person who submitted the complaint is very important too, they're not a party to the case. And so sometimes there can be some confusion there. So I think we could do a better job of explaining some of the processes. I think that investigation policy is a good starting point, but I think we could do a better job of helping people understand what all is involved in that.
Thank you.
I don't know the number of, this is kind of in that same category, and I know we're getting a little off topic of like the survey versus this topic, but I think it's something that has concerned other professionals when there is a report made and there's this letter that comes and there's an expectation to get all this documentation in, but then it sits in my mind when I hear these stories dormant for weeks, months, and there's no feedback. And so is there any thoughts or discussion about having kind of a feedback mechanism, or it's in this stage of the process mechanism to give that feedback to the providers that we serve?
Yeah, and I think we have had an unusual circumstance in the last couple of years. Last year, we had the highest number of complaints that we have ever received against licensees. So I think we had around 250, and the previous total was just a little over 200. So that has created an issue for us. We have been working through some of our internal processes, and that has involved having some additional training for our investigators, learning kind of how other states are doing things to see if we can be more efficient with different things. But I think also as we're continuing to get more and more people licensed, we should, at least from the numbers, we're reviewing this too to see, was this just a 1 year unexpected spike, or are we going to continue to see more complaints? And I think now we have enough information this fall that it does appear that it's not just a temporary spike. I think we're going to need some assistance. So we've had some conversations here, and we're planning to make some adjustments with staff members' responsibilities to kind of work on things to make sure that things are continuing to move as quickly as they can. Our investigators do a tremendous amount of work, and we've even had some internal conversations here too that, in some other states, you're not able to talk with an investigator. They don't answer the phones. You may submit something and maybe you hear back, maybe you don't. One thing our investigators, I think, do a really good job of is providing good customer service and helping people out as far as they can. We don't give legal advice. We can't give certain interpretations of hypotheticals and things like that, but we do try to talk to people and keep them informed as much as we can. But I think part of this may come down to we're shifting things around a little bit to provide some additional supports to our investigators to make sure that things continue to move as quickly as they can. But like I said, in terms of the licensee or the person who submitted the complaint, I understand that they would like resolution as quickly as possible, and I'm very empathetic to that. On the other hand, if there's more information that needs to be collected, or we've had situations to where people have had really significant health issues, or there have been legal issues that have made things more complicated and have lengthened how long an investigation takes. Sometimes those things do need to take longer, but for the things that we can control, we're trying to kind of work on those things too.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, and I would just, it's hard for me not to interject because I chair the complaint review committee. So it just is, I think there's a huge knowledge and education gap, and I hear it even in this advisory committee of what actually takes place. So I hear that as an education, and I think there's a piece that we could solve in that, just understanding, echoing what a difficult, stressful time it is for a licensee when a complaint is filed, and also giving time for the investigators to thoroughly gain information from all parties. And, then they complete a really wonderful investigative summary that then gets scheduled to the complaint review committee's agenda. So, I think there is a lot of steps that is really intended for fairness and objectivity. But to the licensee who has received a complaint, we do understand what that feels like to just sort of be in a sort of a black hole of information, right? So yeah, the good notes. I appreciate the comments, and yeah, I think there's probably opportunity there for us.
Now that feedback on the survey was good. Part of doing a survey like this, you open yourself up to any comments, but that's a way that you also can help identify issues that you can work on. And so you want to take the positive comments with the critical comments and
Absolutely.
and figure out what you can address next. And so I really appreciate the individuals who offered those up in the survey, because it did highlight some directions for us to work on. So.
Yeah, I also kind of on this same line from a comment, the comment about adding some language about professional conduct in the community. I think we're seeing more complaints around licensed professionals' behavior, whether that's personal, that is problematic and seems non-professional, or how they're presenting in the community. So I thought that was interesting to note, because we are seeing more of those types of complaints about how people are holding themselves up in different aspects outside of a therapy room, so to speak.
Well, any other comments on this question, or would you like me to move to the last question?
I think let's move to the next question.
Okay. Well, in previous surveys with the social workers that I mentioned before, there were occasionally times that someone would say, I wanted to provide a comment, but I couldn't figure out where to fit this. So I'm going to say this phrase here for this question. So we decided for these surveys, we wanted to have sort of a catch-all to allow individuals to provide additional feedback in case there was something that they wanted to make sure we were aware of that maybe didn't fit under the other categories of the survey. So on page 25, question 18 for both groups of licensees, the question said, do you have any other comments or feedback you think would be helpful for the members of the advisory committee to receive when evaluating possible recommendations for changes to the statutes and regulations for the marriage and family therapy profession? So yes, a catch-all question, but also point back to what this committee may have authority to do, and also the direction that this committee is charged with, and that is to support the work of the board and make recommendations on changes to statutes, regulations, potentially other policies, but that is primarily the work of the advisory committee. So LMFTs in their responses, there were 44 LMFTs who responded to the survey. The summary information is on page 25. Also, the full responses are in Appendix 17 on page 71. 30 respondents indicated having no comments or feedback to provide. So roughly about, 2/3 of the total respondents. Of the individuals who did provide feedback, the most frequently reported recommendation was to either join a multi-state compact or find a way to make reciprocity easier. So there's definitely a lot of support for the multi-state compact idea. Currently, right now, there's no official movement or language being drafted to my knowledge, but I know that there is a lot of support from licensees, so we'll continue to monitor that. Some of the comments and recommendations specific to the BSRB talked about loosening clinical requirements, a belief that the BSRB is too restrictive, prioritizing empowerment of licensees, and maintaining an up-to-date list of available clinical supervisors. Client-specific comments were made regarding the challenges faced by therapists when clients are out of state and want services. Additionally, recommendations were made to specify for the public the differences between the professions overseen by the BSRB. And licensee-specific comments made included the need for more behavioral health providers and the commonly held view of feeling unsupported in the field. For the LCMFTs, 149 individuals answered this question. 90 respondents indicated having no other comments or feedback to provide. So again, about 2/3. However, for the individuals who did provide feedback, some of the most frequently noted items were prioritizing license portability across state lines or having a multi-state compact. More communication or notifications from the BSRB was requested when changes occur. The high ethics and training standards for the MFT profession are valued by licensees. More guidance on AI was requested. There was a need for accountability with insurance companies, a need for higher pay for MFTs, and then comments and feedback directed to the BSRB or advisory committee pointed out that there is no language in statute or regulation that includes a community protection standard for licensees. Other respondents requested clarity on boundaries and leniency in small towns, as well as on the underdirection and location of the client's requirements. And then other comments and feedback highlighted the need for more education and diversity, systemic issues in LGBTQ plus population, sex and gender, and ethical and effective therapy. Additionally, the following comments and feedback stood out, reflecting potential issues. Licensees have witnessed other licensees ignoring conflicts of interest. Therapists need more support and fear losing their career to online or AI services. And attention was brought to the issue of not having a way to report someone who's providing a service but who has never been licensed. So I'll turn it over to you. What are your comments or feedback in going through the last question or the catch-all? Anything that stood out to you? I guess I will say one thing here that the summary does not mention, but it did stand out to me in looking through the responses. There were several individuals that just seemed appreciative of the fact that we were doing a survey and said they would appreciate doing more surveys. I was talking with Mary about this recently. This is definitely not something that we have the capacity to do on an every year basis. And I think perhaps licensees would maybe get a little fatigue if we had such a lengthy survey every year, but perhaps maybe every 3 years we can ask similar questions and then we can kind of see some changes in point in time information and make sure that the things that we're doing now that we're implementing, maybe we can see if those have changed the comments or feedback to see if we're getting the same requests or if there's changes based on what we're currently working on. So, but yeah, there was some nice notes as far as people, even if they didn't have any specific feedback, it seemed like they were appreciative of the survey process. And so we will definitely do another survey at some point in the future. But I'll turn it over to you. Do you have any comments or specific feedback on this question or responses?
Sorry, I always have thoughts. Because I read this a few months ago when you had sent it, and then rereading it, I think something that stuck out to me was just the continued themes of like the state compact stuff, but then also like this aspect of like when clients are traveling, maybe in another state, being able to see them. And my initial thought was, oh man, it'd be really interesting to do something like that. And then I did think about kind of the risk with it as well, like that clinician would need to understand where that person is at and how to help them access crisis supports if they're on a telehealth appointment, which I think we have to do anyways. You know, we need to make sure that we understand that so that we can, you know, get them assistance if, you know, during a session they are sharing something with us. When they're here, we know those resources a lot better and easier because, you know, maybe we're more aware of that. But I understand the risk and maybe why that's not been something that's been approached yet from a regulation standpoint. But it was really interesting to see that that was a theme. And yeah, I was curious if discussions about that have been had on, looking at those restrictions. So that was something that, yeah, was interesting for me. And I had another question that's separate from that. It had to do with accountability with insurance companies and that kind of stuff. And more of my question was like, what does the BSRB, like what's the BSRB's, I guess, role with something like that? I didn't quite know if the BSRB has a role in advocating for some of those things, or with the higher pay for marriage and family therapists. I was like, I just don't know. Is that the role of the BSRB to be advocating for some of those things or not? Chris, you're saying no. But so those were some of, I think that that's probably within the profession, like those, like the double AMFT, probably like they do a lot of that work, I think, on a national level with some of those things. But yeah, I thought that was interesting that it came up in the BSRB survey. So,
Yeah,
okay.
I can respond real quickly to part of what you said because the last year I've been involved with a group working with staff of KDADS, the Department for Aging and Disability Services. There's also been representatives of the Board of Regents, trying to look at just workforce in different ways, specifically in the behavioral health area. And it has led to some productive conversations. And the short answer is that, yeah, when it comes to reimbursements or working with insurance companies, it's really beyond what our agency is authorized or directed to do. We're not in charge of the state Medicaid plan or reimbursements. We're a 12 staff member office compared to the $1.5 billion budget of some of the larger agencies that really oversee the reimbursements and a lot of those, partnerships. But what we do offer on our website, we have a verification portal. So we help insurance companies or other providers verify if someone has an active license and that kind of information we share. Also, we have, tiered licensure in Kansas. And so sometimes there can be some confusion about what an LMFT license means in Kansas versus what it may mean in another state. And so we have used the survey and also things like that group with KDADS to have some additional conversations. And even if, reimbursements are not necessarily our lane, we're not opposed to those for the licensees. And so I've tried to just have more conversations with those agencies and say, is there anything I can share, at least in terms of what we require for license, that could help in terms of some of these license levels get more reimbursements or get parity with some other groups? Advocating for that is kind of beyond us. But if it comes down to just an informational type thing, I'm always happy to meet with people and share information and help with education. So we've tried to take a step forward in that regard.
Well, I think that's what's nice about this survey too, is that this is part of some of that data that you can share with them. Like this is just information that we're receiving from our licensees. And so that's really helpful. Thanks for sharing that.
Any other comments or feedback on this question?
No, I think in general, that's, my comment was around that. I think there's just confusion around what is a BSRB role versus what is an association or trade group's role in advocacy and particularly as an insurance. And then it gets confusing because those people might see that there is testimony provided from the BSRB often. So, whether that's a proponent, opponent, or a neutral testimony, it's still, that can be confusing probably to see being part of a legislative process, but also not responsible for like insurance and payment side of things. Any other comments? Okay, well, I will transition us then to the next part of the agenda. Dave, did you have something?
Just kind of as a last thought, we've done a really good job of reviewing a lot of these questions on the survey. I think you may have a logical question of, okay, we have all this information, we've really dug into it. What do we do with this now? And so I think now perhaps what I'd recommend is looking back through your notes. If you had a copy of the draft report that maybe you were marking up or you were highlighting something to return to, we can continue to talk about any of the topics in the report. And I hope we do kind of focus on some of these things because the goal I think was, we would learn a lot from this survey, but also potentially some of these things may help be some things that are help motivate or drive the work of the board or the advisory committee for the next year. And so I think we did a good job of analyzing the information. But I think now the next step could be to say, okay, how do we take this information and move it into something to work on a few of these topics? So maybe be thinking about that for the next meeting, just as far as a discussion of how can we move from this survey data to maybe some action items that we work on as an advisory committee for 2026.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Okay, we will move to the regulation review, and in your packet is KAR 10259, renewal and reinstatement. Leslie, are you going to lead this part?
Yeah, and I will.
Are you going to share too, Dave?
Yeah, I'll share my screen here, and Leslie can kind of walk through these regulations just to kind of frame this conversation again. There was a bill that passed a few years back that all agencies were going to be essentially providing information to the legislature on all of their regulations to say if they were necessary for implementation of state law. And also, are the agencies being good stewards of these regulations? If is there information that needs to be updated, is there terminology that's outdated that needs to be replaced? Should all these regulations even still exist? Are there things that we need to, modify? And so there have been some regulations we've brought to you in the last few years that have been, media regulations like the unprofessional conduct standards, the continuing education requirements, the education requirements for licensure. But there were several regulations that the advisory committee had not specifically reviewed in several years. So we wanted to give you the opportunity to review the language of those. And then I asked Leslie and her role as assistant director and licensing manager to review these regulations and come with some proposed edits, or also to let you know that she doesn't have any edits for these. She thinks they look good. But so this is an opportunity for you to ask any questions about these regulations, or if you have any items you think would be good as far as proposed edits, we can consider those too. And then if there's recommended changes, we can forward those to the board. So at the end of the discussion on each regulation, I'll ask you, is there a consensus, one direction or the other? And then if there is consensus, we can recommend that something either move to the board or we'll just note it in the minutes that it was reviewed and there's no recommended changes at this time. So with that said, I'll pass it back to Leslie and she can talk about KAR 102-5-9, the renewal and reinstatement regulation. And I'll share my screen here so you can all see that. Okay, you should be able to see KAR 102-5-9.
And excuse me, what I find really are little minor changes. The first one would be found in subsection B, like boy, and it is to strike the in the third sentence or third line down, the licensee may reinstate the license by paying the required renewal fee plus the late charge. I think we should strike renewal and then strike plus the late charge and just say pay the required fee prescribed in KAR 102-5-2 because we have the difference of 1 year or 2 years, the reinstatement fee changes. The next change would be in subsection C, and it's in the third line, and it would just be to strike renew and put reinstate the license. Because once it expires, it is actually reinstating, it's not renewing. Let's see. Then on page 3, subsection E. Oh, go back up. Sorry, it's page 2 on you, Dave. I've reformatted it so it's bigger.
Little e.
It's little e number 2.
Okay.
Again, striking and the late charge set forth in the fee regulation. Most of the time, the fee to reinstate after it'll have been over a year by that time, so it would just be the renewal fee. And I think that was all I had on that regulation.
Okay.
Yep, that's it.
Any members of the advisory committee have any questions about those 3 proposed edits?
No.
Okay. Did advisory committee members have any other requested changes or edits or questions about the regulation? Okay, I'm not hearing any. I'll stop sharing my screen here. Let me just ask you, are there any objections to moving these 3 proposed edits forward to the board as a recommended change?
No.
Okay. I don't see any opposition, so it appears that there is consensus to move these 3 forward as proposed recommended changes. So we will go ahead and do that. And so those will be moved to the board. We'll move next to the second regulation, which is KAR 102-5-13. Licensee consult with physician when determining symptoms of mental disorder. This is one that we briefly talked about at the last meeting. This does link to a statute, and so we are a little limited on how much we can change in the regulation, but this is not a statute that we really talk about very often. So we wanted to give you the opportunity to ask any questions about it or to discuss it. And then if you do have any recommended changes, we can definitely discuss those. I'll share my screen and we can pull up that regulation together. Again, it's KAR 102-5-13. And Leslie, did you have any recommended changes for this regulation?
No, I really think this is more, if there's going to be any changes, because it's part of it's linked to the statute, it would just be in the language that the committee felt, was more appropriate. There's nothing that I have.
Okay. Do any advisory committee members have questions about this regulation or any other proposed edits from advisory committee members? I'm not hearing any. I'll stop sharing my screen here. So if there's no recommended changes for this, is it the consensus of the advisory committee to just note in the minutes that this regulation has been reviewed and at this time there's no recommended changes? Any opposition to that?
No.
Okay. Then we will just note that it had been reviewed. I think it is helpful to have minutes that reflect that. That way, we can just have a point in time where we know that it has been reviewed at this certain date. And then perhaps in 3 years, if it has not come up again, we can make sure that we reviewed it to make sure the language is not outdated at that point. So some of this is kind of tedious, but it is good to verify to the legislature that we are doing the work. We're trying to be good stewards of this work and make sure it's all up to date. So moving on to the next regulation, it's regulation KAR 102-5-15. And this is in your packet. I'll share my screen here so you can see a copy of KAR 102-5-15. This regulation is on services rendered to individuals located in the state. And I'll turn it over to Leslie. Leslie, do you have any recommended changes for this regulation?
No, I don't. This just basically says if you have a client who's physically located in Kansas and the services take place, you have to be licensed in Kansas to provide those services.
Any questions by advisory committee members or any recommended changes for this regulation?
No.
I don't have recommendations. I think it'll just be interesting though with the feedback that we got on the survey. If there is ever a conversation down the road about licensing and compacts and all of those things, like if we would have to adjust the language of this. I'm not saying it is now because that stuff isn't in place. But so to your point, maybe in 3 years there's going to have to be some adjustments in language. But I
Yeah,
don't have recommendations.
it's interesting, for sure, because that regulation talks about, we look to the location of the client, and sometimes people have called the office and said, I want to provide telehealth services from Kansas to Italy, or I want to provide telehealth services from Kansas to Nebraska. And they say, am I okay to do this? And there's just layers to that answer. And I don't provide legal advice to people, but I try to help them kind of know what questions they should be thinking about. And one of those is, we are not the ultimate authority, and part of this is a jurisdictional thing. So Italy decides who can provide teleservices into the country of Italy and their citizens. And different states also have similar authority to determine who can provide services into their state, because it deals with probably their state constitution to make sure they're protecting the members of their, the citizens of the state. So that's where it really all derives from. So if someone says, am I okay with this? Well, in Kansas, based on those regulations, we look to the location of the client. And so if someone's providing remote services into another state and the client's located in the other state, that may not be an issue that would be a violation, in regards to the BSRB or Kansas, but I can't tell them if they would be okay based on what the other state would consider. And so I usually say, it's your responsibility to go ahead and contact the other state or other country to find out what their requirements are. So it's a qualified answer, but that's the kind of questions we want people to start thinking about, and really understand that because there are different jurisdictions and different rules and different authorizations, it is complicated, but those are the questions you need to ask. You need to make sure you follow that chain. So is there any opposition to reflecting in the minutes that this regulation was reviewed and that there is no recommended change at this time?
No
Okay.
objection.
Then we will just say by consensus, that was the recommendation of the advisory committee, and appreciate your work on these regulations. I have received information. I got an email, I think on Tuesday of this week, from one of the staff members of the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules and Regulations, JCAR, and that is the committee that is looking at all of the regulations for the BSRB this year. The BSRB is up for regulation review in 2026 with several other state agencies. Every state agency was kind of put on a little 5-year rotation. And so we are up this year. We've done a lot of legwork in preparation for this. And what we were asked to do was fill out a giant Excel sheet with a lot of responses and answers and submit that by July. So we have a fair amount of time in 2026 to work on it, but we will be working on it early. And I really appreciate all of your work going through those regulations, making recommendations in past meetings, and also continuing to work on them here. I don't believe that all state agencies are going through a process like this, but I appreciate your work on it because I think it is the right thing to do. And I think it will help us if they ask questions as far as, are you being diligent in your role as a state agency in using committees to review these regulations and make sure the language is still appropriate. So thank you for your work on these regulations.
Great, thank you, Dave. We'll move on to the continued discussion on AI. And for those in the meeting, there is a document attached in your packet that's examples of state regulation on artificial intelligence. So there are some state examples. It'll be interesting with the executive order that was just signed, while we continue to have discussions, like what will the executive orders mean at the federal level for us as we sort of talk about some of these AI issues. So.
Yeah, and like I said, I apologize for getting you materials later than I normally would for this meeting, but just think about this document and then also the second document in your packet as maybe some homework for the next meeting when we meet again in February. February. The first document, as Mary mentioned, highlights some recent laws that were passed. One in Illinois, which was House Bill 1806, one in Nevada, which was AB 406, and then in Utah, which was House Bill 452. And so there are copies of each of those bills in the packet behind if you want to look at the exact language, but there's sort of a bulleted list of takeaways from those bills if you want to take a look at that, kind of see what other states are looking at or working to prohibit. And then in Utah, they've done a number of things the last few years in the area of AI, and there is a Office of AI Policy that has been put together, and it has 4 staff members, a director, head of research, lead AI legal and policy analyst, and a head of stakeholder outreach. And I thought that was notable. I think, in some other states, maybe if they created this, it would be a one-person office, but they've really put some resources towards this. And they had a 54-page guidance letter that was called Best Practices for the Use of Artificial Intelligence by Mental Health Therapists on their website. And I thought, that's perfect for what we're looking at right now. So I decided to pass that along to all of you. So between now and the next meeting, please feel free to read through that and see if there's things that we can borrow or learn from that might influence our conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. And I think, well, if anyone hasn't read the executive order, there are some carve outs that might be helpful to look at too. But I mean, states are moving forward with these things, and as Dave mentioned, they're very the best ones are kind of well directed into regulating online therapy, bots, and things like that. So thank you for putting that together. Although the full, if anyone has time, the full bills are really rather interesting to read. So, and encourage you to do that if your time allows on that. Any other discussion, comments, thoughts? Okay. We'll move into new business items, and one of those is discussion of safety training for practitioners.
Yeah, and I think I can frame this discussion. And so we've talked a little bit about the role of the BSRB and sort of what we're charged with in terms of to protect the public. And so we are limited because the legislature did create the agency with the goal of protecting individuals who are receiving services by regulating licensees. And so part of that involves issuing licenses and following the law to make sure that people are meeting the standards to be authorized to practice, and then also providing a mechanism for which individuals can submit complaints against practitioners, and then having a way to go ahead and handle those in a fair and consistent way. And so we're limited in what we can do outside of our main responsibilities and charges. However, in certain communities, we understand that there are issues that will come up that will involve the field, and we want to be helpful in those conversations too. Um, you know, I'm going to try to kind of talk about sort of a high level situation that I've been made aware of recently without getting into the details, just because on a case by case basis, sometimes it is helpful for individual situations to be handled. In closed sessions when it involves particular people. So at these types of meetings, generally what we talk about is kind of broad discussions and high level discussions. And so I've been made aware of some situations, or at least a situation recently where individual licensees were curious what the board could do in terms of providing guidance in terms of issues with clients. And what I would say first and foremost is my general guidance. If someone were to say there's an issue with the client, I would make sure they understand that we, like I said earlier, we don't take the role of, law enforcement. If there's a safety issue, we always help direct people to law enforcement or the appropriate authority to handle any issues in that area. But if that's already being done and they're saying, what can we do in terms of helping out in terms of keeping the field protected, I am very empathetic to those concerns. Um, I struggle with this a little bit because it is a little outside of what we are able to do. And there are legal reasons why we can't provide certain guidance or interpret things. There's been people over the years that have asked me, can you define more clearly what therapists are able to do or divulge under HIPAA or other things like that? And unfortunately, in a lot of situations, what I have to tell people is, I can't provide legal advice and neither can the staff, but you may get assistance from your own legal counsel. You may benefit from that if you choose to go that direction. So sometimes that is what we have to kind of tell people, that you maybe get assistance from deciding to pursue some guidance from legal authorities. But there is still especially with not having a strong state level association, I do feel like there are licensees that are asking, can the BSRB be helpful for licensees, in terms of safety issues? And I was thinking about the supervision guidelines that we have helped develop for individuals seeking clinical licensure, where perhaps some of these things are not requirements, but we are trying to connect people to helpful tools to be good resources. And so, in trying to figure out, is there a way that we can provide assistance without stepping too outside of our role as a state agency with limitations in terms of what we can control? Um, Perhaps we could look into the area of safety trainings for practitioners. And for social work, there is a requirement of a safety training when individuals become licensed as a social worker for the first time. And I think there are those types of safety trainings that are available, but we could perhaps start to have a conversation about maybe spotlighting some of those available trainings, or maybe even recommending some best practices or highlighting some best practices in this area. So um, I'm trying to kind of stay at a high level here, and just say that we want to be empathetic to individuals, in terms of safety. We want everyone to stay as safe as they can. Um, but then again, on an individual basis, we're limited in what we can really share. And so I hope that information is helpful. But I did want to go ahead and list this as a topic to see if there was interest from the advisory committee about perhaps this would be something that we could have a discussion on to be helpful, or perhaps there's other thoughts by members of the advisory committee. But I thought maybe it'd be helpful to list this on the agenda and then open up a conversation in this area.
Would it be possible or helpful to maybe require like a 1 hour safety training with continuing education?
On a personal level, I would say yes. It's a very difficult environment right now to make a lot of things required. So, so I think it would be beneficial. I would encourage people probably to do that. It's not a requirement, but I think making things a requirement is just so challenging now, because anything that we have sought to put in as a requirement in the last few years has really been challenged by the legislature as a workforce type issue. And so I think this would definitely be beneficial for people. I think there's a lot of good reasons why other states may have a requirement of something like that, and probably why it was put in place for the social work profession years ago. It just may be challenging to get that put in as a requirement right now.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make, is that those are the kind of things right now that, we're trying to solve problems without requiring things. And I think, just to even though we're having a high level discussion, I think there's clarification points that maybe the BSRB could be helpful with. Maybe not interpreting HIPAA, but understanding maybe a therapist's right to protect themselves in situations that may involve criminal activity. I think those are some gaps. And we always think about protecting our clients, but we don't talk a lot about protecting ourselves as licensees. So, I mean, I think there's some maybe pieces in there that, safety training. What would that safety training look like? The social workers did that as a result of a very serious violent crime. and years back, and that became a mechanism by which they say, we want you to understand your surroundings and what can happen, and how to protect yourself. And so to me, this does have a similar thing of what can we do to provide education and support to our licensees about maybe misinformation or some knowledge pieces that would help people in their own practices.
And Mary, I think that is on point. I think that's just like we talked about the role of the BSRB and all the other pieces about what it can do and what it can't do. I think that any education we can give people on understanding the overall process, understanding where you draw the line to protect yourself. I think social workers probably, like you said, from a very serious incident, also having more of a history of going into people's homes, it made more sense. But I think having any kind of information to educate, I think would be helpful.
I was thinking too with what you were saying, Heidi, like maybe it's not so much making it required, but if we can point to how it links to some of the requirements we do have. I mean, we have to get CEUs anyways. So one, it would be like a training like that would count towards our CEUs anyways. But if it is linked to something like ethics or HIPAA already, that might be nice. It might be more incentive for people to be like, oh, this training would count towards these ones that are required, but have this extra layer to it. I really like some of those ethics courses that aren't the same ethics one that I've taken. Like maybe it's a different training, but it's the same training. You know what I mean? And I think it's helpful to be reminded of that. But when there's maybe something new that I hadn't considered before, I think that that's really nice. So just a thought that maybe it is linked with some of the ones that are required, but has some other layers to it that could be helpful.
Well, and David, is the BSRB still offering like attend this CEU for free type situation that we once upon a time talked about a long time ago?
You're talking about the jurisprudence webinars?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we are hoping to launch that later this month.
Okay. Do you feel like that could be an option too, of like, let's add some safety stuff in it? Or is it like pointing more at like other trainings or other resources?
Well, it's interesting. I just kind of had a thought, because when we looked at the continuing education regulation, there are a number of different categories that sort of outline what qualifies and what does not qualify. And at the bottom of that section, it says approval shall not be granted for any of the following activities. This was in just for reference, KAR 102-5-10. It's the continuing education for licensees. And in section G, it says approval shall not be granted for any of the following activities. And then number one is first aid, CPR, infection control, or occupational health and safety courses. And then there's in-service training, if the training is for job orientation or job training specific to the employing agency, or any activities for which the licensee cannot demonstrate to the board's satisfaction the program goals and objectives are to enhance the licensee's practice, ethics, values, skills, or knowledge in the marriage and family therapy profession. Maybe the direction this conversation could go is to revisit that language in the regulation, and perhaps the advisory committee could say, we would like to revisit that section of the regulation that really says general training on things like safety. Maybe that should be something that would qualify for a certain number of hours within a time period. And then at least you're outlining that, or at least you're spotlighting that may be something that would be helpful to include under one of the categories. So maybe that would be a good place to start. You also asked it could be covered by the jurisprudence. I think in a limited way, the jurisprudence really focuses more on, what the state level requirements are for things like, licensure and unprofessional conduct. But I mean, I think that there could be some information, but it would be something that probably wasn't under the original conception of the jurisprudence. But maybe revisiting this regulation and having a conversation about, do you want to expand what could qualify for CE hours? Maybe that would be a good place to start.
Yeah, as you were talking about that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think that that's a great thing to visit. I was just thinking that at my work, I have to do a de-escalation training every year. And I've gone back and forth and I'm like, I mean, there's so much trauma-informed care language in this. But I'm like, I think that that's maybe skirting a line. And so I don't ever count it because it feels like it might maybe not be allowable. And so I think that's a really great direction to have with that conversation. Yeah.
And I'm curious.
I came back on the unmuted myself. I was going to say maybe making it somehow, and obviously I'm not creative like that, but making it known that certain things could count. It's not just self-defense. For social work, it's the same thing. You can't just go take karate. You have to take a course that talks about clients and escalation and de-escalation and all of that so that it was, we could make it clear that it would not be something you couldn't count.
Yeah, I think these are all great notes. And I think the point was made earlier, like you can tie this to client confidentiality. So you can get into ethics issues. You can, it gets into, how to kind of duty to warn and then duty to protect yourself kind of things. So I think there's all sorts of ways we could look at it, but that would be great to bring that regulation back up.
I'm also curious. We've talked a lot about education of the licensees about the BSRB and the what they do. Could that not be an ethics opportunity that's presented at like looking at around the state where there might be a large conference going on, and then that's an ethics CEU where people from the board are presenting, and that would be an ethics opportunity education.
Yeah, I am open to that. We are definitely doing some presentations currently, and we're looking to expand some of those. There are some, regulatory board associations that are a little outside of one specific profession, and some of those do offer continuing education. They have certain requirements that they are going to qualify for CEs. Now in Kansas, we have what this qualifies for state level requirements kind of specified in the regulations. So, but some of those associations, if you're going to present, you need to make sure that you're meeting whatever those associations would require if they have pre-approved for their associations. So we'll look into that. I think these are good comments. I definitely want to continue this conversation, but maybe this would be a good first step to kind of see if we can, revisit this and put a spotlight on it and incentivize people to get more training in this area and be able to count it. So
Thank you for putting this on the agenda. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I think this almost is a natural segue into the next topic, which is discussion of topics for 2026. I think we've pulled out a lot of things today that we could put on our meeting agendas for next time. So like looking at that safety regulation, also some moving items from discussion into action from the surveys. I know we'll have more conversations about AI in the next year, but are there any thoughts that are top of mind for the committee members on things we should be looking forward to doing, if there's more education needed for our own advisory committee in a certain topic area, or if we feel like we need to bring something else up? Does anyone have any thoughts or ideas?
I have a question. I'm not sure where it would fit. Um, I'm not sure if you all have been aware of the profession within itself not being considered a profession. what in Department of Education, what does that
Oh.
look like, and how does that make sense with all of this?
I think I can answer this question, but
Please.
if others have also researched this, I've heard some conversation along those lines. I think what this at least if it's the version of this conversation that I have heard, there are certain limitations on how much financial aid individual students are able to get. There's like caps on how much, at least federal financial aid, I believe it is, if things are classified a certain way. And so there has been some conversation at the federal level. If you were to move certain professions outside of a certain definition, it would essentially cut that cap in half. So you would have students who wouldn't be able to get as much federal financial aid. I think what part of has been driving that conversation is to say, we have individuals that are going to school, the degrees are very expensive from certain institutions. If they is I think the question maybe some people have been asking is if they can get all that financial aid, is that incentivizing certain institutions to have a really high price point, knowing that they could charge this, but then when individuals get out into the field, they have all this student loan debt and they're maybe working in positions where they can't pay off these high student loans that they have. And so I think maybe one of the thoughts is if you move it and you lower the cap, potentially would that cause schools to lower the tuition? I think that has been the chain of thought. And so I think that has been the thought process of why you might remove certain things from a certain list and put them into a different list. But from what I have heard, there's not been a lot of traction to actually change that. But I have heard that for other professions too, like social work. At least it had been discussed, but I haven't heard there's been any real traction to actually make that into something that would move forward. And if others have heard something different, please let me know. But that is what I've heard as far as certain things not being considered a profession anymore. It sounded like that had to do with that definition as it links back to the caps for federal student loans.
I think you did a nice job summarizing that. And to Renisha's point, I think for, all we talk about is much of what we talk about is workforce crisis. And I think that the thinking logically that a university will change the cost in order to make that happen is a pretty naive thing. But, the implications for workforce if people choose other fields of work because they won't have as much access to higher level education for these professional degrees, I think is something that should be on this committee's radar as well. So that's a nice point, Renisha, to bring up. Any other thoughts or comments on that or other topics?
I was just gonna say some of with this topic that I've heard that I have just there's just a lot of misinformation too. Like there's just that's just our world right now. There's so much information out there and it's trying to figure out like what does this mean and all of that. And so again, I don't know if this is so much the role of the BSRB or other spaces, but how do we help people like understand what that means for you practicing in Kansas? Because like one of the things that somebody told me is this going to change how I'm reimbursed as an MFT? And I'm like, that's not what I understand. Kind of to your point, David, is it has to do more with the side of things with getting financial aid to be able to attend and do some of that. So but I don't know how the BSRB can keep up with that either. There's just so much out there right now about a lot of different things. And so it's how we continue to help, talk through those things and do our research and
Other comments or thoughts on that topic or any topics they'd like to see us bring up in the next couple of agenda items, future meetings? Okay, I'm
I'm
not
really,
here.
I'm really naive about like how compacts work and who initiates those.
Yeah,
I'd like us to, I'm just owning I'm dumber than a rock about that. I'd like to understand that better.
that's a great thing to bring up. And I know Dave and I've had opportunity to talk to AAMFT in the past about that, and then some
Uh-huh.
alternate strategies. I think that'd be a great topic. And it would really fit in line with the survey responses too, of just the evolution of how interstate compacts work and what it would take to get an MFT compact. And there's lots of, yeah, that's a great item.
Okay. Yeah, let's plan to talk about that.
Other thoughts?
I have lots of research on compacts now. So
You do.
I'll bet you do.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, because as an education tool, people might think that the BSRB is initiating those things versus being part of supporting things that are coming. So yeah, great thought. Anything else? Well, as always, Dave and I will invite you to email any suggestions you have for the agenda so that we can keep these things moving forward. But it feels like we've got some heavy topics to continue to work for. Looks like the next item was discussion of our meeting dates. We have a meeting date next, tentative one would be February 13th, 2026 at 10. We have been meeting the second Friday of every other month. And so I'm looking forward in the calendar. If there are major conflicts, we could certainly address those now, or we can tackle those as they come up. But as in general, this time and kind of cadence working for everybody?
Has generally worked for me.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. Well, we'll continue this path, and I know sometimes we have to make some changes mid-year or whenever those meetings come up. So we'll just continue to do what we've been doing. I think Dave also has sort of this caveat in February in particular. As legislative session gets kicked up, there may be times where he's going to have to, revert, and we'll have to reassess this meeting time. But that's kind of an unknown right now. Not a lot of advance notice. Dave, did you want to say anything else there?
Just that since we're keeping the same meeting time, I'll talk to my staff and we'll have them set up the meetings for next year. So just keep an eye out for those calendar appointments, but they should just be sent out on every other month, like Mary said, second Friday at 10 a.m. to noon. So just be expecting those sometime over the next probably week or so.
Okay, thank you. Anything else for the meeting today? Well, if not, I would just express my sincere appreciation to each of you and hope everyone has a safe and nice holiday and can have some downtime. It's hard to get these days, but that would be my hope for everyone this season.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Same to
Mary.
you.
Likewise.
Bye.
Motion to adjourn. I guess I need to formally do that.
I make the motion for our meeting to adjourn.
Thanks,
second.
Stacy.
I second.
Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks.
Happy holidays.